A government that's known for one thing, and one thing only, being tough. They spy on people, they ban protests, they use violence. Then, almost overnight, that same government starts pushing through some of the most forward-thinking reforms of the time. Kind of weird, right? Well, that is the central puzzle of Britain in the 1820s. So, let's get into it. So, the big question we're really going to dig into here is this. Were these so-called Liberal-Tory reforms a genuine change of heart? Was this a real shift toward a better, more modern society? Or was it all just a clever new tactic to keep the lid on things? You know, repression with a friendlier face?
All right, so our story really gets going after 1822. The old guard of the Tory party, the real hardliners, they were starting to move on. And stepping into the spotlight was a whole new generation of politicians, and they were bringing some very fresh ideas with them.
And the two guys at the absolute center of all this change were Robert Peel, the new Home Secretary, and William Huskisson, who was running the Board of Trade. These two were basically the architects of a whole new brand of politics for their party.
But look, before we can really appreciate what they did, we have to understand just how bad things were before 1822. I mean, Britain was seriously on a knife's edge. A lot of people thought a full-blown revolution was right around the corner.
And this timeline really tells the story. You can just see the pressure building and building from the ground up. It starts with the Luddites smashing factory machines back in 1812, and it just escalates all the way to the Peterloo Massacre in 1819, where soldiers on horseback charged into a peaceful crowd. And then, just a year later, a plot to literally murder the entire cabinet. This was a decade of pure, raw, and often violent protest. And the government's response to all this, well, it was an iron fist. They suspended habeas corpus, which is a huge deal. It means they could just arrest you and lock you up without a trial. They outlawed any meeting of more than 50 people. They brought in the 6 Acts to crush radical newspapers. Even something like poaching a rabbit could get you shipped off to Australia for 7 years. The message was clear. This was an age of total repression. So, with that pretty bleak picture in your mind, let's turn to our first reformer, William Huskisson. He's going to take us in a completely different direction. He wasn't really focused on the protesters. He was looking at the engine of the entire British economy, trade. See, Huskisson was a huge believer in this new and pretty radical idea for the time from the economist Adam Smith. It was called free trade. And the theory was actually pretty simple. If the government just gets out of the way, if it stops messing with taxes and regulations, the economy will just boom.
The big problem at the time was that British industry was being choked by these really high taxes, or tariffs, on all the raw materials it needed to import. So Huskisson's response was, frankly, revolutionary. He just took a giant pair of scissors to the rule book and slashed duties on hundreds of different things. The tax on raw silk, for instance, he cut it by over 90%. This was an incredible shot in the arm for manufacturers.
But the most shocking thing he did was get rid of the combination laws in 1824. These were the laws that made trade unions completely illegal. Now, the government thought workers would be super grateful and that everything would be calm. That is not what happened. What happened was an absolute explosion of strikes all over the country. The government panicked a little and had to rush in a new law a year later to limit what the unions could do. It was definitely messy, but it was a historic first step.
And here's a wild, tragic little side note. Huskisson, the man who helped kickstart this new industrial age, actually became one of its first high-profile victims. He was hit and killed by Stephenson's rocket locomotive at the grand opening of the world's first major railway line. It's just a crazy, stark reminder of how fast and how dangerous this new era was. Okay, so now let's pivot to our other key player, the Home Secretary, Robert Peel. If Huskisson was busy rewiring the economy, Peel was focused on completely overhauling Britain's system of law and order. And believe me, it desperately needed it. The entire justice system was defined by this one number, over 200. That's how many crimes, big and small, carried the death penalty. We're talking about things like stealing bread or even just impersonating an army veteran. It was so barbaric that juries often refused to convict anyone, which meant a lot of criminals just walked free. And if you did get sent to prison, oh, it was even worse. These places were just filthy, disease-ridden hellholes. Little kids were thrown in the same cells as hardened criminals. And get this, the jailers didn't even get a salary. They made their money by charging the prisoners for, well, everything. For food, for a blanket. It was a system that wasn't just cruel, it was completely corrupt.
So Peel comes in and passes the Jails Act in 1823, which was a massive shift towards something a bit more humane. For a start, jailers would now get a salary. Prisons had to be inspected, and some basic standards were introduced, like letting doctors in. Now, it wasn't a perfect fix. It only applied to the bigger prisons, but for the time it was a revolutionary start.
And then came the thing Peel is most famous for, the creation of the Metropolitan Police in 1829. You might know them as bobbies. Now, the key thing to get here is that these guys were not soldiers. They were designed specifically not to look like an army. That's why they wore blue coats and top hats, not military red, and only carried a wooden truncheon. The whole idea was to have a civil force to prevent crime, not an army to crush the people.
Okay, so we've seen the reforms. We have freer trade, legal unions, a more humane justice system, a modern police force, a lot of change. And that brings us right back to our central question. Was this a genuine revolution in how the country was run, or was it just a new, smarter strategy to stay in control?
Historians are still split on this, and there are really two big arguments. The first one says, yes, this was a genuinely new liberal government, totally different from what came before. The second argument says, no, not really. The changes were kind of superficial. At its heart, the government was still deeply conservative and didn't want any major fundamental change.
Now, the case for repression continued is pretty powerful when you look at what they didn't do. The Corn Laws, which kept the price of bread artificially high to help rich landowners, they didn't touch them. The horrific conditions in factories and city slums, they didn't do nothing. Slavery in the colonies, still going strong. And the really big one, reforming the corrupt voting system, they fought that tooth and nail.
But then again, the case for genuine reform is also really strong. I mean, these weren't just small tweaks. Getting rid of the death penalty for over 180 crimes, that literally saved lives. Legalizing trade unions gave working people a voice for the very first time, and creating a police force that actually worked made cities safer. You can't deny that these things had a real positive impact on people's lives.